The year is 1258. The Tigris River is flowing red with human blood and black with the ink of burning books. The Mongol horde has just erased Baghdad, the most advanced city on earth, slaughtering 800,000 people in a single week. They are the most terrifying war machine history has ever seen, and they have never lost a major battle. Now, they are turning their eyes toward Egypt, the last stronghold standing between them and the total destruction of the Islamic world and Europe. The kings of the world are trembling, preparing to surrender. But there is one man who refuses to kneel. He has no royal blood. He has no right to the throne. In fact, just a few years ago, he was sold in a market for a handful of coins. This is the story of the slave who did the impossible. He broke the Mongols. To understand how a slave ended up saving the world, you first have to understand the apocalypse he was living in. In the 13th century, the Mongols weren't viewed as just an army. They were seen as a punishment from God. They moved faster than any army in history, sleeping in the saddle and drinking the blood of their horses to stay on the move. When they arrived at a city, they offered a simple choice: surrender and become slaves, or resist and be exterminated. Most chose surrender. But in Cairo, a different kind of warrior was waiting. They were called the Mnat. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were boys who had been kidnapped from the steppes of Central Asia, sold into slavery, and raised in barracks with one singular purpose: to be the perfect killing machines. They had no family, no home, and no loyalty to anyone except their master and each other. Among them was a man named Qutuz. His story is almost too tragic to believe. He wasn't born a slave. He was actually born a prince of the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia. But when he was a child, the Mongols invaded his home, slaughtered his family, and sold him into chains. The Mongols didn't realize it, but by enslaving that boy, they had created their own worst enemy. He was bought by an Egyptian sultan and rose through the ranks with a burning hatred for the people who had ruined his life. Now, with the Mongol army approaching Egypt and the government collapsing in fear, Qutuz looked around the room of terrified generals and realized there was no one else left to save them. He seized the throne, not because he wanted power, but because he was the only one brave enough to use it. Qutuz was a man living a contradiction. By blood, he was royalty and nephew of the ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, but by fate, he was a commodity. When the Mongols first swept through his homeland during his childhood, they didn't just destroy his kingdom, they stripped him of his identity. He was captured, dragged in chains to a market in Damascus, and sold to an Egyptian slave merchant for a handful of dinars. He was brought to Cairo and inducted into the Mamluks. Now, it is crucial to understand what a Mamluk actually was. In Arabic, the word means one who is owned. But these weren't ordinary slaves. They were the most lethal fighting force in the medieval world. Purchased as young boys, they were cut off from their families, converted to Islam, and subjected to a training regimen that would break most men. They practiced archery until their fingers bled, and horsemanship until they could shoot backwards at a full gallop. They were owned by the state, but they were the power of the state. Qutuz thrived in this brutal meritocracy. He climbed the ranks from a nameless soldier to the vice-sultan of Egypt. But while he was rising, the world around him was falling apart. The Sultan of Egypt at the time was a 15-year-old boy named Al-Mansur Ali, a child who was more interested in racing donkeys and playing with pigeons than leading a war council. Meanwhile, the Mongol armies were burning Aleppo and Damascus, inching closer to the Nile every single day. The Mamluk generals were paralyzed by fear, bickering over money, while the smoke of burning cities drifted toward them. Qutuz knew that a child could not stop the apocalypse. In a move that shocked the court, he arrested the young sultan and seized the throne for himself. When the other emirs accused him of treason, he silenced them with a single truth: "We need a fighter, not a child. If I defeat the Mongols, you can depose me. But if we do not fight now, there will be no Egypt left to rule." He was now the Sultan, but he had inherited a kingdom that was next on the Mongol hit list. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. 4 men on horseback arrived at the gates of Cairo. They were envoys from Hulagu Khan, and they carried a letter that was designed to freeze the blood of anyone who read it. It is one of the most terrifying documents in history. Qutuz gathered his generals and read the words aloud from the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, to Qutuz the Mamluk, who fled to escape our swords. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. We have conquered vast lands, massacred all the people, and made their children orphans. We are the soldiers of God on earth, created out of his wrath. Resistance is futile. We will shatter your mosques and reveal the weakness of your God. So stop your resistance, or you will suffer the most terrible catastrophe. Silence fell over the throne room. The message was clear: surrender or die. The other generals were shaking. They urged Qutuz to pay tribute, to beg for mercy, to do anything to avoid the wrath of the Mongols. But Qutuz looked at the envoys, and then he looked at his generals. He knew that showing fear to a bully only invites an attack. He did something that was unheard of in diplomatic history. He didn't write a reply. Instead, he ordered his guards to seize the 4 Mongol envoys. On Qutuz's command, they were dragged out and sliced in half at the waist. Their heads were then hung from the Zuwaila Gate in Cairo for everyone to see. This was a point of no return. By killing the messengers, Qutuz had burned the bridge to peace. He had forced his own country into a war for survival. He turned to his terrified generals and delivered a speech that would go down in legend. "O Muslims, I have killed the envoys. There is no going back now. I am going to fight the Mongols. If you want to join me, come. If you want to stay, then go home. But know that the sin of seeing our women enslaved will be on your necks." Shamed by his courage, the generals rallied. For the first time, the Mamluk army didn't wait behind their walls. They marched out of Egypt to meet the beast in the open field. The 2 armies met on September 3, 1260. in a dusty valley in Palestine called Ain Jalut, which translates to the Spring of Goliath. It was a fitting name. The small Mamluk David was about to face the Mongol Goliath. Qutuz knew he couldn't beat the Mongols in a straight fight. Their cavalry was too fast and their archers were too deadly, so he decided to use their own trick against them. He hid the bulk of his army in the hills surrounding the valley and sent a small vanguard down into the center, led by his most trusted general Baybars, attacked and then quickly retreated over and over again. The Mongol general Kitbuka grew furious. Seeing what he thought was a weak and cowardly enemy, he ordered a full charge. The ground shook as thousands of Mongol heavy cavalry thundered into the valley. They thought they were chasing a fleeing victim, but they were running straight into a kill zone. Suddenly, Qutuz gave the signal. The hills erupted. Tens of thousands of Mamluk soldiers emerged from the trees, surrounding the Mongols on three sides. The trap was sprung. But the Mongols were not ordinary soldiers. Instead of panicking, they fought like demons. They smashed into the Mamluk left wing with such ferocity that the Egyptian lines began to crumble. Soldiers started to throw down their shields, preparing to run. The entire plan was about to collapse. This was the moment where history usually ends. But Qutuz did something unforgettable. Seeing his men wavering, he ripped off his helmet and threw it to the ground, exposing his face to the arrows and the sun. He drew his sword, screamed "Wa Isluma," "Oh my Islam," and charged alone directly into the center of the Mongol horde. It was a suicide run, but it worked. Seeing their sultan willing to die, the Mamluk soldiers stopped retreating. They turned around and followed him into the slaughter. For hours, the valley rang with the sound of steel on steel, until finally, the unthinkable happened. The Mongol lines broke. The Mongol general Kitbuka was captured and dragged before the Sultan. He remained defiant to the end, promising that the great Khan would return and burn Egypt to ash. Qutuz didn't wait to hear the rest. He ordered his execution immediately. For the first time in history, the unstoppable Mongol tide had been permanently stopped. The myth of their invincibility was shattered forever. But this story doesn't have a happy ending. As the victorious army marched back to Cairo to celebrate, Qutuz went hunting with his trusted general and friend, Baybars, deep in the desert, away from the eyes of the army. Baybars drew his sword not to protect his sultan, but to kill him. Qutuz was stabbed to death by the very man who had fought beside him at Ain Jalut. Baybars returned to the camp, announced the death of the Sultan, and declared himself the new ruler of Egypt. Qutuz had been a slave, a general, and a king. He ruled for less than a year, but in that short time he saved an entire civilization from extinction. History often remembers the kings who built great monuments or ruled for decades, but it often forgets the lonely slave who stood up when the rest of the world was kneeling. So, was Baybars a villain for killing his friend, or was he just a political realist doing what had to be done? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. And if you want more stories of history's unsung heroes, make sure to like and subscribe.